Sure, we can go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor John Dellery to our ICS Wednesday seminar. I think it's very pleasant to welcome him and listen to him on his topic, the topic which he offered to speak on, managing China's rise with North Korean characteristics. Professor Dellery, actually, he had been Professor of Chinese Studies at GSIS Yonsei University. He also holds Chair of International Cooperation Program, as well as Director of Center of Oceania Studies at Yonsei University. He is also associated with Council for Foreign Relations, National Committee on US-China Relations, National Committee on North Korea, CSIS, and so many other government and research bodies. He got interested in China and Chinese studies when he visited Beijing, I think almost 2.5 decades ago. And he obtained his bachelor, master's, and doctoral degree in Yale University. And in PhD, he chose to specialize on modern China. That is basically 1600 till present. And he wrote his PhD thesis under Professor Jonathan Spence. His dissertation explored the life and thought of an eminent 17th century Confucian thinker, Gu Yanwu, and reconstructed his ideas about political, economic, and social reforms in the early Qing dynasty. He has taught at various places, Brown University, Columbia University, Peking University, and he has been Associate Director of Asia Society. While working with Asia Society, he came in contact with Orwell Sill, and both of them, they wrote a very wonderful book, which is quite, you can say, popular, Wealth and Power, China's Long March to 20th Century. This book is basically translated into Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. His context with Korea begins with actually, he's getting married to a Korean girl, and then actually coming to Korea to meet his in-laws in 2006. And then 2010, he joined Yonsei University, GSIS. His contact with North Korea begins in 2009, probably physically when he went to North Korea. And he had been several times to North Korea, including in 2013, when he visited with Google executive Eric Schmidt. He had been actually quite, you can see that China, Korea, and US actually connecting all the three important, you can say, players in the regional politics. He has published lots of, you can say, articles in world-renowned journals, Asian Survey, Journal of Asian Studies, Asian Perspective, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, so many. And he has been also contributing editor, book review at Global Asia Journal, where he is associate managing editor. The main areas of his academic interests have been Chinese history, US-China relations, and Korean Peninsula affairs. As I mentioned that today he's going to talk about managing China's rise with North Korean characteristics. And it's a very interesting topic. When I think we look at China and North Korea relations, it's a very interesting that there are many layers of relationship. And most of the time, most of the scholars, they capture one or two layers and they miss few other layers which are there. For example, generally China and North Korea relations is called to be a relationship lips and teeth, or comrade in arms. Or we understand that more than 90% of external trade of North Korea at present is only with China. So all these narratives and factors are presenting one side of China and North Korea relations. But at the same time, we also need to be aware that from very beginning, we may say that North Korea has been trying to keep a safe distance with China. And that's why I think a very interesting article written in 2004 by Andrew Scobell, he mentioned about comrade in arms to allies at arm's length. So trying to capture this relationship, a very, you can say, complicated relationship. I can give you a few examples in case people not from, you can say, detailed, you can say, Korean study, that Korean War period also, when Chinese volunteers were fighting with along with North Korea, the commander of Chinese volunteers, Peng Dehui, he had lots of, you can say, verbal, conversation, verbal, disagreements with Kim Il-sung. And in 1956, when lots of Chinese faction and Soviet faction leaders in North Korea, they were purged, I think Peng visited North Korea along with Soviet representative Anastas Mikoyan, and both of them, they tried, actually there were rumors that they are going to topple Kim Il-sung and install somebody else. The story is not yet known what happened and how come Kim Il-sung was able to survive. North Korea has also, as you know, that they have not been, actually, they did not participate in Council for Mutual Economic Alliance, which was there. And I think at least on 2 occasions, there have been lots of problems from North Korean side, which are with China. One is in 1978 when China started opening up, because that was considered to be deviation from the path of socialism. And 1992, when China established formal diplomatic relations with Republic of Korea, that is South Korea. So a kind of betrayal was there in the minds of North Korea. And I think many scholars, they say that North Korean nuclear program could also be located in North Korea, the sense of isolation and allies moving away from them, and domestic conditions are not looking very good. So this Duchy idea of North Korea is a very interesting idea which captures North Korean desire to remain a socialist country, at the same time try to have some kind of autonomy of its own. It was Duchy roughly could be, you can say, understood as North Korean style of socialism. So I think in last 7 decades, it has been a very interesting relationship. And when we are talking about rise of China and how North Korea is going to look at it, suppose one option could be that North Korea may think that, look, the most closest ally, they are becoming stronger, they are rising, so it's good for us. We are going to have much more economic and other security assistance from China. But at the same time, given the history of 7 decades, North Korea may think that a rising China, a stronger China may try to intervene more in their domestic affairs, and that could create problem for North Korea. They may feel that maybe China, when they are going to rise, they are going to maybe try to be neutral arbitrator between South and North Korea. What happened in 6-party talks, 2003 to when China initiated, China hosted the 6-party talks, trying to play a neutral role between inter-Korea. So it's a very complicated sentiment and feeling for North Korea. And I would like to draw your attention about the last thing, and then probably I will invite Professor John Dellery. When we talk about China's rise, we talk also about assertive China. And this assertive China has been talked quite a lot in, say, 2013 when Xi Jinping came to power. But it's very interesting to note that from 2011 December, when Kim Jong Un came to power, till 2018, the top leaders of China and North Korea, they did not have any meeting between each other. That's really very interesting that when China's rise, its assertive China's rise was moving forward, at the time, there was disconnect between China and North Korea. That basically probably captures that how North Korea and China, especially North Korean point of view, how they look at China's rise. So I will say that even in, like, say, post-2018, when Kim Jong Un started meeting Xi Jinping, before Singapore summit, before Hanoi summit, before actually other important, you can say, inter-Korea or say North Korea-US meetings, I think in that period also, according to KCNA, at least in 2019, there were 3 articles by somebody called Zhong Pil, which mentioned that China is rude, China is shameless, we have nothing to owe to China, and all those critical things. And many scholars, they probably think that this Zhong Pil is a quite important person. Actually, one of the UK professor, he mentioned that probably he could be maybe Kim Jong Un. So it's a very complicated relationship, and it's I think the person who could make us understand, comprehend about this complication, the best person could be Professor John Delaney. I invite him for this talk. He may speak for around 30 minutes, and then we can go for a very interesting question answer, because lots of former diplomats and scholars are there, both in Chinese studies and Korean studies. So I will invite Professor John Delaney. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandeep, my good friend and you know, a renowned scholar from India here on the Korean Peninsula. It's so great to reconnect with you, and thank you to the Institute of Chinese Studies for inviting me to join, speak with your group. You know, as Sandeep introduced me, I felt like he knows me better than I know myself. But I do come from a China studies background, but have added a kind of Korea component. So I feel very at home with fellow China experts and students of China. So I'm very excited for this chance to engage. I told my kids I was going to India today, and so here I am. My 5-year-old daughter said, "How are you getting there? Will you fly?" I said, "No." She said, "Have a helicopter?" I said, "No." I said, "I will zoom over there." And she laughed. And so here we are. Sandeep not only introduced me better than I know myself, but he laid out sort of the core of the argument perfectly. So he kind of did the work for me. But let me expand on some of the ideas that he introduced. And essentially, my goal is to sort of put out for your consideration a kind of framework for how this is essentially a thought experiment, imagining how North Korea looks at China. And specifically, I won't get as much into the history. We can discuss that. So Sandeep complements well. I'll focus on Kim Jong Un's North Korea and Kim Jong Un and maybe strategists around Kim Jong Un, if we imagine how they look at Xi Jinping's China. So that's sort of the task. And then I hope it will open up a discussion where we can both, I welcome critiques of the view, and but then also we can discuss potentially the diplomatic implications of that, and even I think opportunities. And I think that can be quite fertile ground as well. So let's start by noting the anomalous nature of PRC-DPRK relations, of that relationship. If you look at them on paper, and I guess on a map, and know kind of the first level of facts about them, you would think they should be the best of friends. For starters, and we'll be reminded of this, actually we were just reminded of it a couple days ago with exchange of verbal messages between Kim Jong Un and Xi Jinping, and you can put it on your calendars for July, because July of this year will be the 60th anniversary of their Defense Treaty Alliance, 1961, July 1961. So they're treaty allies. And that's a remarkable fact. It's something that we should really put at the beginning of our analysis, because the DPRK is, of course, as you know, all know, China's only treaty ally. And likewise, China is North Korea's only ally. So that in and of itself puts them in a very special position vis-a-vis one another. Secondly, they are both Communist Party states, controlled from their beginnings, 1948 and 1949, founded as states, North Korea 1 year older than China. To the present, they have been controlled under a Communist Party political monopoly. And while the North Korean system is de facto hereditary, not constitutionally, but de facto hereditary, at this point, you could describe the two, there's almost a kind of convergence, I would argue, given how strong Xi Jinping has emerged as a leader of the CCP, the fact that he change the constitution to get rid of the term limits, and we don't know how long he'll be around. In a way, we knew when Hu Jintao would leave the scene. We don't know with Xi Jinping. So he has been altering the nature of the CCP in a direction toward North Korea, where you have a much stronger, of course, even to the point of hereditary single ruler of the party. And I would argue Kim Jong Un is actually moving North Korean communism closer to the Chinese model, in the sense that he's been strengthening the party. And to some extent, that means weakening the strength of his family vis-a-vis the party. So at that ideological level, there are also both anti-imperialist, nationalistic forms of communism. So in terms of ideology and in terms of the system of government, again, these should be the best of friends. They match very well. Third, if we look at geography, there are many aspects of this, but I would just note the critical strategic importance of one to the other. North Korea is, famously referred for going back to the imperial period and echoed by Mao Zedong and others as the lips that protect the teeth of not only Northeast China, but the capital. The Korean Peninsula is essentially one attack corridor. And of course, it's been used in not that ancient history, in modern history, as an attack corridor through Manchuria and into the capital, the northern capital of Beijing. So that gives it great strategic significance to China. And the same is true for North Korea. China is the rear base and again, historical experiences in still recent memory by North Korean standards, when North Korea is facing occupation, which it suffered, or elimination, which it nearly suffered in the Korean War, its salvation comes from Chinese aid and Chinese support. So geographically, they are of critical strategic significance. And then finally, the fourth kind of category of why they should be best of friends is economically. Now, there's a great asymmetry in much of the relationship, and especially in economic terms. Obviously, we can't compare the Chinese economy to the North Korean economy. But if we narrow it down and look at, for example, the Chinese Northeast, one of, if not, and I'd be happy to be corrected or challenged on this, I haven't really thought it through or looked into numbers. But if we think about the land borders, the frontiers of China, Dongbei, Northeast China would count among, if not the most, in terms of its industrial economic productivity and importance to the rest of China. It's certainly in the first tier of important landed frontier regions. And that makes it vulnerable to anything in North Korea. If something goes terribly wrong in North Korea and spills over the 1,200-kilometer border, then it's hitting a critical economic engine that will affect the rest of the Chinese economy in a direct way. And the case is even stronger from a North Korean perspective. As we know, as Sandeep mentioned, North Korea is, at this stage in particular, it's a bit anomalous by its history, but it is overwhelmingly dependent on the economic ties to China in terms of exports, imports, and investment, absolutely dominated. Its external economic relations are dominated by China. Okay, so in these four categories, here's all the reasons why they should get along. And yet, again, as Sandeep pointed out, those 6 years, we cannot forget. We cannot let them, because they're trying to make us forget that for 6 years, there were no visits by Kim Jong Un. And those are the first 6 years, 5-6 years of Xi Jinping's, his first term in office. Those are years in which Xi Jinping visits South Korea. Those are years in which the South Korean president visits, visits Beijing, establishes a pretty extraordinary, this is Park Geun-hye, the previous conservative president, establishes a pretty extraordinary rapport with Xi Jinping, then receives him, a hero's welcome in Seoul. And then, of course, as you'll recall, Park Geun-hye famously goes to, in September 2015, is sort of the peak of South Korea-China closeness when she visits and stands on Tiananmen Square balustrade, only one person away, I think separated by Putin, next to Xi Jinping to celebrate the anniversary of the victory over Japan, over fascism in 1945. Really an extraordinary moment. And the North Korean representative is kind of in the shadows down at the far end of the second row. Now, of course, those years, late 2011, 2012 to 2018, are years of what we might call North Korea's third nuclear breakout, and arguably the most successful of them, where Kim Jong Un demonstrably and in really dramatic and impressive ways improves the strategic weapons capability, the missile programs, and the nuclear weapon program, all of which is not to China's pleasure. They may not want or be willing to risk much to get denuclearization in any near term, but it's not in China's interests, and China's not pleased, and was certainly not pleased during those years. And indeed, it was in the increasing frustration with Kim Jong Un, and then and on visits to Beijing, I could pretty easily pick this up just by having conversations, real umbrage that Xi Jinping was taking at the attitude of Kim Jong Un, that then elicited, by the standards of this relationship, very harsh measures from the Chinese side. So Sandeep mentioned, quite importantly, what we were seeing in their state-controlled or state-approved media, a kind of hostile messages, polemics on both sides that I think the closest precedent of that, you had to go back to the Cultural Revolution to hear them talking to one another in those terms. But also, and relatedly, of course, China was going along through 2017 with I would describe as kind of a quantum leap in the sanctions regime imposed against North Korea. It really moved from the familiar pattern of UN Security Council resolutions that were more or less trying to target the program and expanding beyond that. But there was a real quantum leap on paper, and China was enforcing a good deal of it, to what was, by the end of 2017, sectoral embargoes on the North Korean economy, banning industries like seafood and textiles. These are not industries that are directly funding the strategic weapons program. This was a different kind of economic pressure, and China was signing off on that. And of course, caps as well on energy imports to North Korea. So we have to, our attention span is so, we can barely remember. It's getting a little better. For Americans, for a while there, we could literally not remember 12 hours before what had happened on Twitter. So we're slowly regaining our ability to remember and retain. But I would stress it's so important as we analyze this often mercurial relationship between two quite hard to know states, and in particular hard to know in their relationship with one another. We need to remember these are facts that I've stated. We can debate some of them, but it's basically a fact pattern characterizing, again, the first 5-6 years of the relationship between Kim Jong Un and Xi Jinping. Now, why? Because in my view, much of that friction was at if I were to describe that was Kim Jong Un's decision to challenge Xi Jinping, to not show basic respect to Xi Jinping, to sort of dare him and push him into an adversarial relationship. And so I think it's worthwhile, and what I'll try to lay out next is sort of an explanation of, again, from the North Korean perspective, why it would make sense to do that. And so if we return to the four categories I used at the beginning of why they should be the best of friends. Let's revisit those categories. So first, in terms of the treaty alliance relationship, on the one hand, it's remarkable that China keeps North Korea and to some extent promises to protect North Korea as its only defense treaty ally with the Article 2 of their 1961 treaty. But we also know alliances work in many different ways, in very complex ways, and in particular, the kind of alliance here of a asymmetrical alliance from a exponentially more powerful, economically, militarily, and by all measures of national power, exponentially more powerful China as an ally of a much weaker states and obviously much smaller state, not even the size of a province in North Korea. In those kinds of asymmetrical alliances, and I was just looking for the purpose of this talk for a good quote. I thought it'd be fun to quote my friend Victor Cha, who I'm sure some of you know. And I was looking at his book Power Play, a very good book on the American alliance system in Asia. And he describes the whole thesis of power play is, in his words, that in this case, the United States is acting not only to defend the anti-communist, the non-communist allied countries, but also to constrain them from going rogue. That is the term that Cha uses, and he and the rest of his book is really showing how the power play is on two levels. And we see that the North Koreans certainly understand that the treaty is also there to hold them back, to keep them on a leash, as much as it is to protect them in certain kinds of contingencies. And North Korea, with really the logic of any state, but especially the North Korean unique traditions of trying to figure out how to maintain, which actually we see in South Korea as well in different form, trying to carve out autonomy and protect its autonomy in a pretty intimidating neighborhood of more powerful states. North Korea is extremely cautious in that relationship, in recognizing that China is using the alliance to hold it back, to constrain it, to pressure it to do its bidding. Moreover, in a case of contingency, how reliable, if you're standing in North Korea, how sure are you that Beijing is really going to show up? There's a certain set of circumstances where you can probably count on China coming even to your military defense, but there are many other ones in which it's not at all a given that China will defend you in a contingency. So the importance of that treaty alliance has to be heavily discounted and even resisted from a North Korean perspective. Now, secondly, in terms of ideology, okay, they're both Communist Party states and have been since their founding. But of course, being communist didn't prevent the PRC and the USSR from being adversarial powers for 30 years. It didn't stop them from coming to the brink of nuclear war and armed conflict along their border in 1969, nor did being communist stop the PRC from invading fellow communist Vietnam in 1979. Inspiring, as I always like to point out to my students, inspiring one of what I think is among the best books on, in general, the nature of nationalism. Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities begins with this puzzle of why is China invading Vietnam? These guys are communists. Vietnam, in fact, is I think quite interesting from a U.S. perspective, and maybe we can come back to it, but a very interesting model of how a communist country can have these deep strategic tensions with its fellow communist China and get along with them, but also seek a counterbalancing relationship with the United States, involving at this point even, most recently, just as Corona was ending these kinds of things, as some of you may know, the U.S. Navy made a port call in Da Nang in Vietnam, really a remarkable turn of history, the place that combat troops, US combat troops arrived on China Beach in 1965, and now a friendly visit by the USS Teddy Roosevelt in March of last year. So, so how far does the ideology go when national interests actually conflict? I think Vietnam gives us one indicator of how much glue that can really be relied upon in terms of North Korea-China relations. My third category, geography and geographic continuity, of course, that is no guarantee either. And I don't need to tell an audience in India about the fact that having a long border with China does not guarantee amity, and in fact can be the source of all kinds of trouble and conflict, both historically and into the present. In fact, there are not well known, I would describe them as sort of repressed underlying territorial disputes in the kind of Manchurian borderland between China and Korea, between the PRC and DPRK, but they're pretty deeply repressed, and that's not what I'm referring to. They could surface, but they're worked out for now, and they're kind of a dormant, deeply dormant volcano. But what I mean, it's different than the situation, the border between India and China, or Russia and China for that matter. In the North Korean case, North Korea, of course, unlike India and Russia, is again a tiny country. It's a country of 25 million people. And it's a country, a small, poor country that is really sealed off. Now, the reason it's sealed off is because of hostile relationships with its neighbors, and that hostility is its own doing. At least 50% its own doing, 50% the doing of South Korea, the United States, and Japan. But regardless of how you apportion the blame, the fact of the matter is North Korea is sealed off. It's sealed off in the maritime space by what's called this, I guess you need some familiarity. Those of you who know Korea know it, but there's something called the NLL, the Northern Limit Line, that essentially cuts across the Yellow Sea, or as we call it, the West Sea, and basically creates a maritime barrier for North Korea to interdict the flow of everything from a North Korean perspective through the Yellow Sea. And then of course, the DMZ, as you all know, runs across the length of the Korean Peninsula, blocking North Korea. And then the NLL picks back up in the East Sea, again, establishing a kind of southern barrier. And meanwhile, you can't go too far off the east coast of North Korea before Japan is going to show up and tell you to get out of here. These are our waters. So North Korea, in terms of that geography, has this long border with China, and then is sort of sealed and pressed against the wall of this massive country that it has this complicated relationship of a kind of dependency with. It's not the most pleasant metaphor, but that's the point. I describe it as being sort of stuck up in the armpit of the Chinese Leviathan. And as China gets bigger and stronger, as these muscles develop, and this is something, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. That's what's happening. That's a natural development that everyone is sort of dealing with. But North Korea is dealing with it sort of from inside the armpit of that increasingly powerful and muscular state. And so the geography is actually quite uncomfortable and disadvantageous to North Korea. And finally, in terms of economic, the fourth category, in terms of the economic relationship, the economic dependency that I described, that Sandeep alluded to, that every newspaper article will note 90% of goods come from China, and it's probably at this point higher than that. So that Chinese domination of exports, imports, and investment that, North Korea in some ways is quite unique. In other ways, it's not. And the problems that would exist anywhere also exist in North Korea. In basic business, as well as strategic terms, you don't want one other country as your only investor, as your only trade partner. Many of the Chinese entities that are involved in North Korea are there for material profit. They're profit-driven entities. And when there's no other competition, when they have a monopoly, when North Korea has essentially economic relations with no one else, that is disadvantageous to North Korea as it seeks to develop or profit from exploitation of its resources, of its labor pool, et cetera. So North Korea, for the same reasons that really every country wants it, would seek diversified economic relations. In fact, it's my view, and this we can debate, this is debatable, but it's my view that the one factor, not the only, but one factor in the abnormally low volume in absolute terms, the incredibly small volume of trade, of foreign trade and investment that North Korea conducts. And this would be pre-COVID. It's gone almost to zero, but pre-COVID, it was still abysmally small absolute volume. So you'd only see, China's 90% of North Korea's trade, but North Korea's trade was on an order of magnitude, that was incredibly small. And now there's internal reasons for that, as far as the retrograde business environment and the way North Korea works, if you're a business investor, and I don't want to discount those. B, as I've described, as is well known, there is an international economic and financial sanctions regime that makes it incredibly difficult to do business in North Korea and keeps a lot of people away. But I think a third factor in the limitation, if we widen the aperture and look in maybe a 10-year, 15-year lens for why North Korea has maintained such a small volume of trade, in my view, it's precisely because they do not want their dependency to get any bigger on China. The fact that there's no other investors, there's no other markets, there's no other corporations to deal with keeps this lid on how far North Korea will allow external economic relations to go in general, because they don't want to give that kind of leverage to the Chinese. So, and I'm conscious of time, Sandeep, and moving to a finale that we can open it up for discussion. North Korea's this security alliance and what we could call the GeoEconomic Dependence on China that we see right now, that is exaggerated certainly by COVID to some extent, but was there before COVID, in my view, is a temporary and even superficial feature of the region. And that under the surface, Kim Jong Un has compelling strategic reasons to want to and even need to escape this fate as China's only ally. Now, I would also expect him to escape that fate in a very cautious and prudent way, not in a dramatic defection, although I myself have used the word defect once or twice. But even a defection, I would expect him to do in a very, very careful and cautious way. Nonetheless, I believe he is looking for it or will look for it, not because of his personality, not because he spent time in Switzerland, but because the nature of this particular relationship and because of the four factors I described sort of push him toward that and push his advisors around him to look for that, at least to look for it. Okay, and so I'm closing here and opening at the same time, because we can, as Sandeep chooses to moderate, we can again look back at this, and I welcome challenges or further ideas, but I am also quite interested in exploring, let's say I'm even 70% right in what I just laid out. I'm very interested in exploring the implications, the strategic or also diplomatic opportunities, implications, if that tension, if there is that deep, ultimately distrust and tension in the alliance, in the North Korea-China alliance, then, for example, North Korea's pursuit of what was called establishing new relations, that was the key phrase used, I think, 3 times in the very short Singapore statement between Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump. By my logic, North Korea's pursuit of, quote, establishing new relations with the United States, of, quote, peaceful coexistence, which was the key phrase used also in 2018 with South Korea in the inter-Korean agreements and statements in Panmunjom in the spring of 2018 and in Pyongyang in the fall of 2018. So that pursuit of new relations, non-hostile relations with the United States, new relations, peaceful relations, reconciliation with South Korea, I view those as real strategic objectives of North Korea, rooted in these forces I've described. And therefore, there are real diplomatic opportunities for primarily the United States and South Korea to transform their own relationships with the DPRK away from hostile ones, as they are basically now, toward neutral, reconciliatory, even in some measure cooperative ties. So how to do that, and also what are the implications of, there are at least 2 very large elephants in this room I've built, the nuclear program and the human rights abuses of North Korea. What effect it has on those, I open to the wisdom of this incredible group of diplomats, because at the end of the day, I'm just a history professor. And so it's much harder for me. So I need your help working on that second half of these ideas. So that's what I wanted to present. And thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Gallery. It was really very comprehensive and very insightful presentation of China-North Korea's relations. And I think I will invite actually Professor Ambassador Skantyal to say something about, make his comment or questions.
Thanks, Sandeep, and I join you in complimenting and congratulating Dr. Dillery for this very, very informative as well as very well analyzed look at where Kim Jong Un's North Korea is vis-a-vis China. 1 or 2 things I recall when I was there. I was ambassador there till 2011, and the Chinese ambassador in Seoul, who had in fact come from the party side, I don't recall his name, and he used to say always that North Korea doesn't listen to us, and the nuclear program we don't want, and we want their economy to open up and they should follow our model, etc. But of course, North Koreans always said that the Chinese have strayed from the true path, as Professor Daluri also mentioned. Here, tangentially, I would like to say that the Chinese suzerainty over Korean Peninsula historically had a light touch. In Joseon Dynasty, the kings used to send tributes to the Forbidden City or to the emperor. But the Chinese really did not try to rule very directly on the Korean Peninsula by interfering in day-to-day administration, or as far as I know, there was not even a resident ambassador or somebody who is all the time trying to tell the Korean king what to do, what not to do. So this entire North Korean journey from Kim Il-sung onwards, Kim Il-sung's fighting the Japanese and going to China to fight the Japanese and conducting the army, etc., has been for a fiercely independent Korean Peninsula or control over Korean Peninsula, and that tradition continues with Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. And maybe this nuclear capacity which North Korea has acquired against great adversity and challenges from all quarters is of course for regime survival and to have some kind of a deterrence against the US. But I'll agree with you that this also strengthens their hands in against China, that China also cannot dictate to them. And with Chang's book you mentioned, I think there is an element of policy making truth in that. So if nuclear capacity development is very important for North Korea, both to deal with the United States and hostile powers, as well as to deal with a sole-friendly power on which they depend, China. All right. Here, one question I've already sort of, I've asked myself, I asked Sandeep, but not got a very good answer, that how could North Korea develop this entire nuclear program, missile program, without any outside help? You know, we know from our experience, you need cryogenic engines, you need metallurgical composite materials of all kinds, you need supercomputers for tracking, etc. Then a couple of years back, that ICBM was displayed on some 20-wheel truck, which in some parade in Pyongyang. How did they manufacture all that? Is China turning a blind eye to something going from Beijing to, or from China to North Korea, or China or North Korea has this kind of phenomenal R&D capacity, scientists, and manufacturing capacity? That is something which admirable, I would say. It is admirable if a third world country, if a poor country can do it. I think we have to compliment the North Korean government for that. Then in this context, when you mentioned that how can China escape the dependence on, North Korea escape or get out of the dependence on China, has the time come for the world to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons power? From giving by our own example, how did our relations with the United States improve? Once the United States gave up this entirely, absolutely hopeless, the desire to contain India's nuclear program and strategic autonomy, etc., and now relations are good. And Professor, you may correct me if I am wrong, but when I talk to the South Korean diplomats of the day, or when I visited South Korea several times, even after when I was not ambassador, the South Koreans do not feel so threatened by the North Korean nuclear weapon. Once I was there was a nuclear test, and texted, I know nothing. And you compare it with something happens in Pakistan, explodes a bomb, and India, all the channels and everybody will just be talking about that. So there is a certain ground or certain foundation to President Moon Jae-in's belief and his party's belief that the North Korean nuclear program is not against their fellow South Koreans. So against whom it is? And America is too far, frankly. So what I'm trying to say is that is it time to do some out-of-box thinking? And I think President Trump was also inclined to sort of move in that direction, and the American establishment did not allow that. And one small question I have, that when Kim Jong Un was trying to establish his own absolute power in 2012-13, and he got his stepbrother killed here in Malaysia later, etc. That Uncle Kim Jong, that Thek, what is his name? I forget.
Thek.
Yeah, he was also killed, and everybody said that he was like very close to China. Yes. And that's why he was so publicly killed and humiliated. And is there some truth in that? That was he seen to be very close to China, and that's why Kim Jong Un eliminated him? And of course, you have pointed out and all noted that till 2018 there was no meeting between Kim Jong Un and Xi Jinping. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think, again, very insightful and nice, actually, interventions. I would also like to invite Professor Ambassador Vishnu Prakash to make his comments and questions, and then probably Professor Jalari can say respond on them.
Dr. Deluri, first of all, compliments. It was a masterly exposition. I heard it with great interest. First of all, the very important, serious and sensitive question of the ton of books behind you, which one you have not read? that is the most important question of the day. Okay, now let me move to mundane ones. Some are related. I have like scanned a number of questions, but what I'll do is in this round, I'll just pose a few questions and my comments I'll reserve for later if there's an opportunity. So I would like to get your sense on how secure is Kim Jong Un, and the rumors about his health, are they exaggerated? As they said, rumors about my death are a little exaggerated. So is it something like that? And is he secure and confident enough to let his sister call the shots on his behalf? And is North Korea ready to accept a lady, a woman, as the leader should the push comes to shove? That is one. Secondly, since you have the unique you're in a unique position of being an expert on China also, and North Korea, Koreas, and so on. Xi Jinping, is he totally in command? Is he reached a stage where he hears? Is there still a possibility in the system for him to be given independent advice that maybe may not be music to his ears, but does he have access to independent input, or is he the situation is such that everybody has been have been beaten into submission, and he only gets to hear what he has to. Now sanctions, uh, given the strained relations with the US, of US-China relations, have sanctions busting become a common feature with China, by China? And are they just now doing what they want to do, or sanctions are still holding? There is some restraint on China, North Korea engagement. Then Secretary Blinken was in Seoul recently, and according to media reports, obviously North Korea was discussed. Is there any indication that the Biden administration is looking at softening its line towards North Korea? And Trump under John Bolton and Pompeo took the position that it's all or nothing. So does the US still, at the moment, and the position will evolve, are they thinking in terms of all or nothing, or are they willing to ease the sanctions a bit so that the talks, the engagement can restart? And lastly, uh, the dreaded word denuclearization. Is there any situation, hypothetical, that I would, or the best case scenario, where you see North Korea completely denuclearizing? Because as you know, in history, no nuclear weapon state has denuclearized. And Koreans are pretty smart. They know history. They see what happened to Gaddafi. They know what happened to Saddam Hussein. So can they in any situation denuclearize, or the best case scenario would be from the everybody's perspective, a limited, verifiable, uh, reversible denuclearization, where they maintain just a deterrent. or without, let's say, ICBM capacities which can target the mainland. And my theory is that all countries in the neighborhood can actually live with a limited denuclearization, where they have a limited deterrent, except Japan. I think that Japan is the only country which is really worried even of North Korea having a limited WMD capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think, Professor Delri, you have multiple questions and you can say things to respond on. You may choose actually any of them to, you can say, as per your framework.
I would request him to give me all the answers to all my questions. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Delri.
All right, well, thank you. I'll first look at I've read all of these that I can see behind me as far as the books. Thank you to you both, ambassadors, for the comments, the insights, and the questions, and the insights also embedded in the questions. Let me do what I can to respond to some of the specific issues and then some of the broader ones that you've raised. So let me start with some of the specific ones. For example, on Jangsong Tech, that's an excellent example that I could include in the list of those years to remind us of how bad things were. And particularly if you look at North Korea's statements, it's extraordinary. They told us way more than we needed to know about what Jang, the uncle, had done wrong and why he was a traitor and a criminal and should be executed. And in that rap sheet of charges, it included, I don't think it ever said the word China, but it was quite obvious. It very explicitly talked about the China aspect to his essentially treasonous activities. And so that is where you saw Kim Jong Un drawing out the spear and poking it. So it's a very good example. Now, the only caveat I would add is both the idea of Jang Song-taek as reformer, in my understanding, was exaggerated and hyped. Also, the idea of Jang Song-taek as having this really special relationship with China. For example, when before and after that incident, in my conversations with Korea experts in China, they viewed, basically what I heard was, look, Jang Song-taek had the China portfolio, so we dealt with him, but we'll also deal with whoever he wants to send after Jang Song-taek. So it's not as if there was this really deep relationship with Jang. So I thought, again, it got a little bit overstated, but it does fit the pattern of that hostility in those years. So it's a good example. And on the same order, Ambassador Vishnu, in terms of Kim Jong Un, how secure is he, his health, and the issues you raised around succession and the sister, I have no special insights into, I just hear all the rumors, there's constant health rumors of gout and this and that, and but I have no particular insight into that. He is, at the end of the day, still among the youngest heads of state in the world. And, I don't think it's a good idea unless we see much more dramatic examples. I mean, he's overweight and there are some obvious health issues, but given how young he is and his father and grandfather had decent longevity, so his genes seem to be okay, I do think there's a danger of a policy mistake that Americans I know are prone to, of sort of, well, how long will he really be around? Because you don't want to deal with the reality of him. So and that relates to the other questions about his, how secure is he, and also the succession issues. I mean, I would say in particular after Jang Song-taek, which was a very clear, that's a case where we saw the North Koreans, again, by their own admission, had very serious power struggles and needed a purge at the highest level of a family member who was a very senior party official. And so we know from that he, Kim Jong Un, experienced very serious challenges that he felt had to be eliminated. And there's plenty of other, purging and demotion and promotion, but it also more or less fits a pattern of the consolidation of power you would expect of especially a younger dictator, but also it's a hereditary system. So a younger king would do the same thing. And at this point, Kim Jong Un has been in power for 10 years. I think was very significant in 2018, where we saw him traveling around the world, flying. Now, this was on an Air China flight, so that goes to the other side of the ledger to show the trust in China, but flying to Singapore, taking the train to Vietnam, being away from his country for extended periods of time. Those are signs of certain amount of confidence. I think he probably wasn't confident enough to leave the country for a summit, especially in those first years. And that could have explained why he didn't want to go kowtow to Xi Jinping. But we can reverse that to say it's a sign of security. So I view him as having really consolidated his rule and feeling pretty secure. On succession, if something happened to Kim Jong Un now, and even in kind of watching how this will unfold, it goes back to the first point I was making, or suggestion that he may be moving North Korea toward, I think he is moving North Korea closer to a Chinese or Vietnamese model, just as, again, Xi Jinping is kind of moving China a little bit more toward a North Korean model. And one element of that, I think it's very possible he could be the last king of the Kim dynasty, and that there would be an orderly succession of some kind of party rule that would continue in perpetuity. And that in his own mind, it's not necessarily his child who's the ruler of North Korea. That could be highly controversial within North Korea, resisted by many North Korean elites, even maybe some amount of the people who, see the whole glue of the system is this Paektu line and the blood lineage. And so I wouldn't expect him to be public about those things, but it wouldn't surprise me if he, in his own mind, has a very different conception. In this regard, for all our China folks here, another kind of analogous figure I think of is Jiang Jingguo, who, of course, converted a de facto hereditary party monopoly state in Taiwan into a multi-party liberal democracy. Now, I wouldn't expect Kim to make it a multi-party liberal democracy, but I wouldn't put it past him to convert it into a more normal communist party system like in China and Vietnam. On denuclearization, and I can't respond, and some of this is, you've given me food for thought. There is a debate, Ambassador Escan, there is, and you're probably aware of this, there is an increasing debate among, say, the US expert community and commentators, and you see it in the media in a mainstream form, arms control folks who follow North Korea very closely, for example, as well as at least kind of one segment of the country specialist Korea group. And so there's different constituencies of sort of experts in the establishment, foreign policy establishment, who are arguing for some form of what we're talking about, almost no one says, let's just recognize North Korea as a nuclear state. But there are a lot of people who say, let's accept, as you said, the word, let's accept the reality that North Korea has nuclear weapons and that they're not going to give them up on any short time frame. And we can't just keep banging our heads in the wall demanding CVID, complete verifiable irreversible denuclearization. I mean, we can keep banging our heads on the wall, but we're simply banging our heads on a wall. So if it's a conscious choice, but it's a strange policy. That is a stronger voice. I mean, I've been arguing that for 10 years, and plenty of others have some version as well. As far as Blinken's visit and the signals of the Biden administration, so far, quite conventional. So far, they are not giving us the wink, wink, like, we get it. We gotta get out of the handcuffs here and figure out a way to do this diplomatically. I think they'd get a lot of support from those segments of the foreign policy commentariat. I also think as an American, and when I'm home, when I talk to others, I think they get a lot of support from the average American who doesn't care about this stuff at all and is really happy to be told you don't have to take that off your list. You got plenty to worry about. You don't have to worry about North Korea's nuclear weapons. Yeah, they're kind of going to keep them, but they're not going to keep testing them, and they're not going to, you know, threaten us with them. And that's pretty much what, you know, Democrats and Republicans, as far as average Americans I ever talked to, would want as well. So I think there's actually a base for support. But I joke with people, I'm giving them a year. I'm saving my big op-ed for, I think they need about a year to be stuck in the traditional talking points and bang their head on the wall for a while. It's a low priority in general compared with all the other domestic and international priorities. And it will require some daring, and you have to spend a little political capital to come out there and be like, you know what we're doing doesn't make sense on North Korea. I'm going to change this. That would require some courage, because the North Koreans are really tough to deal with, and they're not going to make it easy for you, you know? So, so I'm still a very optimistic person. So I'm giving them about a year. I think they might come around, but I'm not too hopeful in the short term. Let me start with
just one input or assessment, if you give about the status of Xi Jinping, about his extent of his authority.
Yeah. Well, and again, I know there's it's easier for me to talk about Korea stuff, although there's a lot of Korea expertise in this group as well. On my view of Xi Jinping has been from the beginning that he is a function of what the party wants. I've never seen Xi as having sort of taken over the party. It's true that he's a much more, you know, kind of strongman figure, however you want to describe him, than Hu Jintao. But again, all the conversations I was having, and I would kind of presume many of you too, in the late Hu Jintao era, as we know, the discussion was the lost decade of Hu Wen. They weren't happy with the technocratic, bland, the decision-making of the standing committee was too consensus-based. American China experts, I don't know about in India, American China experts love that. They thought, oh, great, it's more like a technocratic system with orderly transfers. But I don't think party elites liked it. They wanted this, and they created Xi. And so I think at the end of the day, he's there at the bidding of the party. I don't think the party exists at the bidding of Xi. I've seen some cases where I think he had to pull back. I sensed some dissatisfaction actually with the constitutional revision. And I think he had, although the Constitution itself is there and he'll probably stay on for the term, I think there was at least a lot of grumbling. And I don't think he's in such a bubble that he's not aware of the grumbling. The last thing I'd say is, as a historian, yeah, and these days I'm working on the Mao period and looking a lot at Zhou Enlai, the diplomacy of the Mao period. And, you know, we know enough about that. We have enough access to records and to documented discussions. And, you know, I don't think we can compare Xi Jinping's supremacy. It's still lower than what Mao had achieved. And yet you look at Mao and the rivals he had within the party, even if they would, you know, as he said, the ones I distrust the most are the ones who hail me the most loudly. Those are the guys to really keep an eye on, you know, and we can go through the names of people we know, senior military and political figures who resisted Mao in various ways. So I don't have the evidence. It's more a historical inference. I'm skeptical that those dynamics don't, which are essentially politics, don't continue to exist and constrain and ultimately actually control Xi Jinping. I think the party runs China, not Xi. That's my general view.
Thank you, Professor Dallery. I think it's good, very extensive discussion. And I would like to can say add another point about Kim Jong Un being stable at his seat, because actually, according to we can say various books, Kim Jong Il, he, like 1994, Kim Il Sung died, and it took 2003, almost after 9 years, Kim Jong Il was able to have all those positions except, say, president. because that was supposed to be eternal President Kim Il-sung. So it took almost 9 years. The same, you can say, succession happened in case of Kim Jong Un just by 2014 or maximum 2015. So it means that and then look at how party Congress and you can say they were not organized and very irregular during Kim Jong-il period. But Kim Jong-un period, things have been quite normal. So I think we need to keep in mind that apparently, given the information we have, limited information, it appears to me that he's much more stable than many Western media they try to project him. Anyway, one question had been asked to you, Professor Dellery, by Professor Hemant Adlakha. He is professor of Chinese studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he had been following very meticulously China. He has a translation blog at ICS in which actually important Chinese articles are being translated into English and they are put into our ICS translation section. So you may visit that. So he said that it's a very insightful and very fascinating lecture on one of the complex relationship China and North Korea. My question is that post-Alaska talks, post-Alaska, several Chinese commentaries have appeared emphasizing don't forget the spirit of the Korean War negotiations. Don't forget the spirit of the Korean War negotiation. Please enlighten us on the relevance and meaning of referring to the spirit by China's mostly ideologically leftist intelligentsia. Thank you. So you may like to comment?
A brief comment, because I have to look up those commentaries, and I may get in touch with the professor or Sandeep. You can help us connect, because I haven't seen that, and that's fascinating. I would love to see that. There was quite a bit, as I think he would, the professor would certainly know. There was quite a bit of celebration around the anniversary of the Korean War last year, which was quite interesting and notable. And so that and Xi Jinping was very prominently involved in the ceremonies, which were also, and I think maybe I can use that to shed a little bit of light, at least guessing, again, without knowing these specific commentaries, but to watch the anniversary of the Korean War, the way it was commemorated last year, again, with a lot of prominence, but in an almost solipsistic way. It actually goes to the points I've been making, that China made a big deal of how we fought the Korean War, but it had very little to do with North Korea. North Korea was not prominently featured in the way in which the war was remembered. It was remembered as a...
May I interrupt? Actually, he's saying that he's referring to, you can say, spirit of the Korean War negotiations.
Right.
Negotiation, I mean, probably he's saying that the way like Chinese volunteers and North Koreans, in a you can say coordination with each other, they negotiated with the Western powers, and they were able to get their things done. Probably Alaska may have some connection with that. I don't know.
Possibly. I mean, as far, again, I have to see the specific reference, and maybe he wants to comment, but the negotiations, there were, during the Korean War, there were 2 years of negotiations in Panmunjom. The North Koreans and Chinese representatives were sort of a tag team, but China was seen, especially by the Americans, as the primary negotiating counterpart. So you had Americans on one side and Chinese and North Korean sort of team on the other. I actually did bring this up in my US-China seminar. We were talking about Alaska and discussing historical precedents, like when is the last time that US and Chinese diplomats, when they were face-to-face in the room, engaged. It wasn't a shouting match, but it was a confrontational, criticizing one another in that style. And I wasn't sure, there may have been some precedents from the Warsaw talks in the they dragged on through from 1954, 55, all the way till 1971. But I actually mentioned maybe the closest precedent is Panmunjom, where if you look at those historical records, it was much more over the top. But I mean, there was on both sides, there was screaming and insults and storming out of the room. And it was that kind of openly hostile and confrontational negotiating style. They were military, not political, and they were lower level. It wasn't at the foreign minister, secretary of state, as we saw. So those are important differences, but that could be the reference that we need to remember our fighting spirit of negotiating Panmunjom when we would sit in the room and point across together with the North Koreans and point in the face of the Americans and kind of not hold back. So that would be my guess, but again, I'd have to see it in context.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? You may raise your hands, or you may, yeah. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, he has been actually India's former ambassador. He's going to ask. Yeah, please, sir. Unmute yourself and yeah.
Thank you so much. Very interesting discussion overall. I have a couple of questions and perhaps a comment. You know, the last party Congress, the DPRK party Congress, at that time, the announcement was made that the North Koreans actually were developing short-range nuclear missiles. So that is something which I think ought to worry both the Chinese as well as the South Koreans. So I'm wondering why actually this particular direction of development of weaponry as far as North Korea is concerned, why that was done. The second question actually is, what is the tolerance level for regime survival, in the sense that in terms of the kind of economic pressures the North Korea is subjected to? I mean, how long can it survive, and what is the tolerance or threshold which actually will have to give before it collapses completely? The other point is that I see in terms of the larger geopolitical diplomacy, I think the relationship between North Korea and China actually is a symbiotic relationship. China realizes that North Korea is important for them to ensure a favorable balance of power in East Asia. And North Korea, knowing that leverage, also wants to make sure that if it plays rogue, it is able to achieve the objective that it actually wants to have in terms of its own national objective, you know. And that national objective really is to become a bit like China come South Korea, in the sense that you have economic modernization in North Korea, but not as an appendage of China, but more through collaboration with South Korea. The other point actually, which is to me is important, is that while we're talking about China and North Korea, we are not looking at Russia, because Russia actually has a critical role in ensuring regime survival of North Korea. And also Russia also sees North Korea as a factor in the balance of power in East Asia. I mean, that's one thing that, because they also have a short border. And when the tension took place, I think year before last between North Korea and US, Russia actually was also involved. So they were actually present, and that's how they all began. Thank you.
Professor Dalli.
Yeah, well, thank you for all those 4 excellent points and questions. So let me share some thoughts. But first, not quite in the order you asked them. First, on the issue, the very big question of survival and how long can it survive? How much pressure could it bear before collapse? I mean, it's late in the day here, so I'll be a little get carried away with my metaphors and poetic license. But I would almost compare North Korea to a zombie, in the sense that it already died. It already collapsed. It collapsed in the 1990s. It suffered one of the worst famines recorded in recent modern history. And that famine was a product of a systemic collapse. You know, the political economy of the old North Korea, the Korea built by the grandfather, by Kim Il-sung, it ceased to function. And of course, that was in the context of post-Cold War, when Russia, for that matter, Ambassador, you're so right to bring Russia in, And, one of the factors was that under Boris Yeltsin, Russia just cold turkey cut its ties, absolutely no interest in North Korea, loves South Korea. And of course, this is the moment when South Korea is zooming up to the top. So everyone wanted a piece of South Korea, including especially the Russians, who ended their relationship and just demanded back payment from the North Koreans, but also the Chinese, who normalized relations with South Korea in 1992 and started the dramatic acceleration of South Korea-China economic ties, which has continued all the way to the present. So all of that is happening in the context of, as Sandeep mentioned, 1994, Kim Il-sung, the political continuity since founding in 1945-48 dies in the middle of that. So that was kind of the death of North Korea as it existed, but it didn't collapse. That's why I say it's like the zombie. It survived really beyond. So I can forgive analysts for writing about the coming collapse of North Korea. I mean, the literature, and there's an outpouring of collapsist literature in the 1990s, which makes perfect sense. But at this point, 2021, the third generation Kim Jong Un, if I'm right, consolidated his regime. It's still very backward economically. That is the absolute Achilles heel. It's one of the poorest countries in Asia, certainly in the region. But as has also been pointed out by Ambassador Eskan, quite extraordinary. However much they borrowed, however much they stole, they did some part of their strategic weapons development by themselves. And it's absolutely extraordinary that they are the world's ninth nuclear power, and not just a second-rate one anymore. And so for all of that, I don't think the question is when, how long can this continue and when will it collapse? I think our analysis should focus on the resilience of their system and figuring out why they're able to survive things like the 1990s and survive the pressures that continue to be put on them with sanctions, with economic pressure, with all these other things. I think for us, for a China group, it's a bit similar to the way, again, I don't know the evolution of the field in India, but in the United States, there was a kind of fundamental course correction for China experts and China watchers who expected China also not to make it, quite naturally after 1989, and it was close. So the question was, well, when will it fall? But by the end of the 2000s, you have, even I think it's 2004, I always use the landmark of Andrew Nathan at Columbia writing an article on authoritarian resilience. And the focus, most of the scholarly focus, academic focus, has been on understanding not when will China collapse, but what are the sources of its strength despite maintaining all the things that we kind of expected would change. So that's my. I think you wanted to comment.
Yeah, Ambassador Yugen Kumar. Like, we have just 2 more minutes, so we have to. Yeah, Ambassador Yugen Kumar.
Very quickly. When I talk about the threshold, I remember, I think sometime back during Kim Jong Un's time, there were food riots in North Korea because suddenly the prices of food grains, food prices were raised for some reason, and then the regime actually bring down the prices. So I'm just thinking that there is some kind of a popular pressure which somehow seems to be working somewhere, and I'm wondering whether that actually is such an uneasy balance, because of which this issue of the fragility of the regime becomes a matter of sort of.
Professor Delhi, another supplementary comment from Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, and then you can answer. Mr. Vishnu Prakash?
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute myself. No, I don't have a comment. I have a quick question. The equation between Moon Jae-in and Kim family or Kim Jong Un, does it still hold? Periodically, we see some adverse comments from North Korea. Is it more playing to the galleries, choreographed, or there is some kind of a daylight emerging between the two leaders? Because I don't think that in recent history, there has been ever a South Korean president who has been so understanding and so
Hmm.
keen to find a modus vivendi with North Korea. Thank you.
Ambassador Tyag, sir, it's okay. Okay, so Professor Delhi, you can answer and you can conclude.
Okay. Well, just to that, to Ambassador Vishnu, that's a great point, a great question. And I mean, you know, it is hard to describe. Some of you were posted here, and Sandeep has spent a lot of time here. As one of you mentioned about when Pakistan does something, the reaction in India, and in South Korea, the South Korean public society is quite curious in terms of you know, how they respond. For example, to again, I think it was Ambassador Escon maybe's earlier comment about the threat perception is much lower here. I mean, people are very thick-skinned about the threats, you know, and the saber rattling from North Korea. They really have to push it very far before anyone freaks out. They really don't freak out. On the other hand, in 2018, there was not euphoria, but there was some real feeling. There was some real excitement when people saw, first with the Olympics, then with the spring summit. What wasn't reported is that there were dozens, there were about 50 inter-Korean exchanges that were going on over the course of 2018. Journalist friends of mine, South Koreans, I would catch up with and they'd say, oh, it's great. I finally got to go back to North Korea. You know, I was just in Pyongyang last week and I haven't been there since the Sunshine Policy, and it was so great. And they would describe the changes, sports exchanges, you know, NGOs here were getting all excited about that. And that is what gets lost in all the high level, you know, denuclearization diplomacy that gets nowhere, is the fact that there still is, I mean, yes, my students don't want unification anytime soon. Yes, there's a whole split between liberals and conservatives. And yet, you know, my lived experience in South Korea is there's a bedrock of feeling of connection, that ultimately Koreans there are the same as Koreans here. The division is artificial, and there are many families that are split, and it's not that far back in the history. And when people imagine the future, it's got to be eventually reunited. And so there's a upswelling, a very meaningful emotion, and that was transferred on to the leaders. You know, so there's a famous picture of kind of the first family. It was like a family romance of Moon Jae-in and the South Korean First Lady and Kim Jong Un and the North Korean First Lady, and they were up on Paektu Mountain, you know, the sacred mountain of Koreanness, right up there on the Chinese border, with this beautiful day and this lake behind them, Heaven Lake, you know. And it was kind of all the mythology, the mythos of the Korean people, who are a people. And so the leaders were, I think, for both their publics, really able to ride that quite a bit. And everything has fallen apart. There's no question. That's why there's so much disappointment. You know, that was allowed by the diplomacy. I mean, frankly, Donald Trump did make that possible. But once Donald Trump lost interest at the summit in Hanoi, then everything fell apart. I'm pessimistic that in a year, Moon Jae-in would be able to crawl his way back to that, again, because I'm a little pessimistic about the early signals. So I think it will fall to the next South Korean leader to try, like Sisyphus, to try once again to climb up Mount Paektu. So we shall see.
Thank you, Professor Dellery. I think it's really a very nice discussion. I think we expanded it to several issues, and we learned a lot. I think one thing I will say at the end, and I will end. Look, he visited China and got interested in Chinese studies. He visited Korea, got interested in Korean studies. And if we consider that his visit to India, Zoom meeting, so it means that in future he's going to include India also into purview of his research and study. Well, connect you to JNU and ICS. I would like to thank actually many people. I would like to suppose we are having Professor Alka Acharya, who is basically Professor of Chinese Studies at JNU. We are having Professor Hemant Adlakha, who asked a question. We are having Professor Madhvi Thampi, who was earlier Professor at Delhi University, Chinese History. We are here actually having Professor Srimati Chakravarti, who was again Professor of Chinese Studies at Delhi University, and she is now retired, but she is chairperson, she is associated with ICS. We are having Mr. Rappai, M. Rappai, who is basically, who worked with Defense Ministry and expert on China in India. We are having actually so many other people. I'm not able to read most of the names, but I think, so it's pleasant and it's very learning to have discussion with you. Thank you very much. We hope that you will be connected to ICS and we'll listen you more frequent and have more exchanges. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, and to everyone. This was really a delight. And next time we'll do it in person. You're all welcome. When this horror ends, you're all welcome here in Seoul. Please let me know if you find your way to Korea. And I promise I will get to India for real.
Thank you.